Okay, so now that your head is swimming with vocabulary, we have our final one, which is our contrapositive. And the contrapositive is formed by negating the hypothesis and conclusion, but not of the original statement, but negating the converse. So up here, for the inverse, you see we took the original statement and we just negated the original statement, so we changed is to isn't and is to isn't. Now for the contrapositive, you're going to write the converse first, so you're going to flip the hypothesis and conclusion, then we're going to make it negative. So the example says write both the converse and contrapositive of the conditional below. So let's look at the first one. The first one says, if you run a red light, so if you run a red light, then you are breaking a traffic law. So let's write the converse. Let's switch the if and then. So my converse would say, instead of if you run a red light, it's going to say if you break a traffic law. If you break a traffic law, then instead of you're breaking the law, it's now then you run a red light. Okay. The contrapositive would be to rewrite this now. I've got the converse. I switched hypothesis and conclusion. Now I'm going to make it negative. It's the inverse of the converse. That's what the contrapositive is, okay? It's the inverse of the converse. It's basically the easiest way to put it. So I would now say, if you don't, because remember we're making it negative, if you don't break a traffic law, then you don't run a red light. So if you don't break a traffic law, then you don't run a red light. What I did again for the contrapositive, it's the converse of the inverse. I'm going to switch the hypothesis and conclusion. So instead of if you run a red light, it becomes if you're breaking the traffic law. And then the contrapositive is we make it negative. Instead of if you break the law, then you run the red light, it's going to say if you don't break the law, then you don't run the red light. Okay? So let's look at the next one. Example 10. Example 10, write the contrapositive. Okay? Write the contrapositive of the conditional, then determine if it's true or false. So here we go with true or false again. All right, we have if and then. If I'm looking for contrapositive, that means the converse of the inverse of the converse. So what I'm going to do is I'm not only going to switch the hypothesis and conclusion, but I'm going to make them negative. So instead of saying, if you ask to leave the classroom, then you must present your ID, not only am I going to flip it and change it to, if you present your ID, I'm going to change it if you don't present your ID. Okay. If you don't present your ID, okay, then you ask to leave the class. You don't ask. If you don't present your ID, then you don't ask to leave the classroom. Again, this is a tough one because contrapositive, you have to flip two things. You have to flip the hypothesis and conclusion, and then you have to make them negative. If you don't present your ID, then you don't ask to leave the classroom. So the question is this true or false? If you don't present your ID, you don't ask to leave the classroom. I would say, you can look at this a multitude of different ways. I would say, to make it easy on us, you know our policy here at school, when you leave the classroom, you have to present your ID, okay? But just because you don't present your ID doesn't mean you don't ask to leave the classroom. You might still ask to leave the classroom and you forget your ID and the teacher says no. So I can look at that situation as it's false, because if you don't present your ID, then you don't ask to leave. You could still ask to leave, you'll just be told no. You could also look at it as, if you're not presenting your ID, then you're not asking to leave the classroom. That can be seen as true. So this one's kind of a gray area, but I'm going to go ahead and mark it false, because to me, if you don't present your ID, then you don't ask to leave the classroom, okay? You could still ask, and teacher says no. Okay? You can still ask and the teacher says no. You don't have to have your ID. You might still ask to leave, but it doesn't mean you have your ID. It doesn't mean you're not going to present your ID. So that's how you do the contrapositive. Once again, you switch it's the converse of the inverse. If you must present your ID, then you ask to leave the classroom. If you don't present your ID, then you don't ask to leave the classroom. Okay? So if you don't present your ID, that means you didn't ask to leave. Well, that's false, because you could ask, but you don't have your ID. So it fits the first one. You didn't present your ID, but it doesn't fit the second one. Then you don't ask to leave the classroom.